The most important position in football is quarterback, and if you don't have a good quarterback and do not have a 1985 Bears defense, or a 2000 Ravens defense, or even a 2015 Broncos defense, you are probably not going to win the Super Bowl. And there's a reason quarterbacks are the highest paid position in football, and it's not really close. The pressure to draft a quarterback and to have a franchise signal caller is high, especially if you don't have one. And every year there are quarterbacks pushed up the board because teams need good quarterback play and are willing to overdraft quarterbacks just to have a chance at getting their guy of the future. NFL teams know the prerequisite for seriously competing and beating the Mahomes, the Allens, the Lamars, and the Burrows in the postseason starts with good quarterback play. But the NFL is also very cyclical, and we heard this a lot throughout the mid to late 2010s when the passing game took over and running backs were not as much of a priority as they were 15 to 20 years prior. And the NFL is going to go through another cycle soon, and it's going to change in a big way. The league is going to have to change the way they develop quarterbacks, and in today's video we're going to break everything down. This goes back several years, and there are a ton of examples of the good, the bad, and the ugly. This is also a video I've been wanting to make for a while, and I think now is the perfect time to do it. Now let's begin. And we are starting today's video by taking a look at some of the situations around the NFL and specifically with younger quarterbacks. By younger quarterbacks, I mean guys in their first or second seasons, and I would include the 2022 draft class, but that was a very bad quarterback class, and we knew that heading into the draft, as there was only one quarterback taken in the first two rounds, which was Kenny Pickett. The only quarterback to work out from that class is Brock Purdy, so again, I'm going to mostly exclude the 2022 draft. But when you look at the 2023 draft class, there were four main quarterbacks, and they were Bryce Young, CJ Stroud, Anthony Richardson, and Will Levis. Also, yes, Hendon Hooker was selected in the third round, and Aiden O'Connell was taken in the fourth round. But we are now a year and a half into these guys' careers, and you can really start to get a feel for how these guys' careers are going to play out, and sometimes it's shorter than a year and a half. CJ Stroud is, of course, the best of the bunch, and it's not close. CJ's situation wasn't ideal, and there were a lot of quarterbacks who would have failed in this situation, and he is without a doubt one of the best young quarterbacks we have in today's game. But when you look at his situation, his offensive line was pretty bad during his rookie year, and the Nico Collins we know now was not the Nico Collins we knew heading into CJ's rookie year. They also had third-round rookie Tank Dell step up, and everyone overachieved relative to what was expected from them heading into the 2023 season, but one thing I do want to highlight is this was not normal. Not even close. And if a team thinks they can repeat what the Texans did in 2023, it is a lot easier said than done. And I would argue that the CJ Stroud development and situation is a bit of an outlier rather than the standard. But the other teams in the 23 draft that selected quarterbacks are in much different situations. Will Levis was a second round pick, and I hate to sound this negative, but if the NFL was high on him, he would have been a first round pick. Surely somebody would have traded up into the first round so that they could have a fifth-year option with Will Levis. And throughout the pre-draft process, I thought Levis was the definition of a hit or miss prospect, and that's how his career has went through the first 14 games. Remember, he didn't get a chance until midway through his rookie year last year and had the great game against the Falcons, but it's been largely downhill for him since. And I'm not going to focus too much on Levis and more so focus on Bryce Young and Anthony Richardson. The Bryce Young we've seen in the NFL is nowhere close to the Bryce Young we saw at Alabama, and I know there's some people that had CJ Stroud above Bryce Young in the draft process, but most people had Bryce over CJ, including the Houston Texans, and it came out after the fact that had the Texans lost that Week 18 game against the Colts in 2022, they would have taken Bryce Young number 1 overall. Now, as we know, Bryce hasn't worked out in the NFL for several reasons. He hasn't been good, he gets happy feet, he gets tossed around way too much in the pocket, and at times plays scared. There is hope from some people that if Bryce gets out of Carolina, that he can in fact turn his career around if given the right opportunity. And it is also worth noting that the Panthers failed Bryce in a lot of ways too, and that the number of quarterbacks that would have worked out in this specific situation is low, and I mean low. It also doesn't help that the Panthers have collectively been one of the worst franchises over the past few years, and there could be an entire video dedicated to bad decisions they've made and how it's hard to do worse than what they've done over the past few years. Now, was Bryce Young going to work out in Carolina? I don't think so. And when you sit back and look at the situation that he had in his rookie season, he had a head coach that was fired midway through the year. He had a poor offensive line that was underachieving from the start, which, believe it or not, is not in Bryce Young's control. His number one receiver was a 33-year-old Adam Thielen, and after that, it was DJ Chark and Jonathan Mingo. And I simply ask the question, how many quarterbacks in their prime, let alone their rookie season, how many quarterbacks in their prime would have succeeded in that situation? And this goes back to what I think the NFL is going to have to change, and it's that young quarterbacks basically come in and fix everything. And Bryce Young was never going to fix everything with that team in 1 year. Even Bryce Young at his peak during his final year at Alabama was never going to go into Carolina and fix that team, because the Panthers, as we know over the past few years, have been a very poorly run franchise. And I don't want to dunk on the Panthers because there's countless things you can dunk on the Panthers about, and recently they traded Deontay Johnson for what was absolute pennies, and it was a bad trade for the Panthers. I mean, they traded him to the Ravens for a 5th round pick and got a 6th round pick back while taking on his salary. So they're moving up maybe 10 spots after comp picks, because there's going to be a bunch of comp picks at the end of the 3rd round for Deontay Johnson, a player that, if Bryce Young could salvage anything, would have helped his development in year 2. But this goes back to the point of young quarterbacks are 99% of the time not going to fix everything. And that's what I think the NFL has to stray away from. And I think a good example of a team that did not want to immediately come in and fix everything from day one is what the Detroit Lions have done over the past few years. They acknowledged from day one that, hey, this is going to be a long rebuild. And that Dan Campbell said basically, hey, if we get knocked down 7 times, we're going to stand up 8. And over the course of a game or over the course of a couple of years, you are going to see what happens when you prioritize rebuilding a team from the ground up, when you build the trenches on both sides of the ball. As whether you guys know this or not, the Lions are absolutely elite defending the run, and it shows week in and week out. And this whole mindset of, well, if we draft a quarterback in the 1st round, not even necessarily number 1 overall, that everything is going to be okay. Now, Anthony Richardson for the Colts is a little bit of a different situation, and I'll explain why. The big thing with AR whenever he was coming out in the draft process was he was a once-in-a-lifetime athlete at the quarterback position, and there were certainly flashes during his time at Florida that he could eventually be a solid player, and we've seen those flashes, whether it was the big touchdown to Alec Pierce in week 1 of the 2024 season, whether it was a couple of plays in his rookie season. The flashes from AR have been there. Now, personally, what I think really did him in recently was the infamous quote after the game where he said, "I was tired, I ain't gonna lie," after stepping out for a play. Now, that is different from any other situation for a couple of reasons, because I have never heard of a quarterback saying, "I'm tired, I ain't gonna lie," and then proceeding to step out for a play. Now, that rubs the team the wrong way, as I can't imagine Anthony then going in the next play and saying the play to Quentin Nelson, hey, gun trips right, Seattle bubble spider protection, and Quentin Nelson looking at him after he knows he just checked out after a play and having any sort of respect for him. And I think that is a locker room losing statement for Anthony Richardson. So that situation is a little different entirely. But with Anthony Richardson developing as a player and developing as a quarterback, strictly from on the field, not from the quotes that have been analyzed and reanalyzed over the past couple of days, Anthony needed time to develop. He needed reps. He has not started a lot of games since high school, and I think the benching for the Minnesota game in week 9 is going to be more of a disciplinary thing rather than a long-term thing, but Anthony Richardson was always going to need time. So if this proves to be a decision where they sit him for the remainder of the year and they have Joe Flacco start for the rest of the year, only for this team to maybe finish 9-8 and then to get absolutely smoked in the wild card round, whether it's by Buffalo, whether it's by Baltimore, whoever, I don't think is a good way to back your young quarterback and to build around the quarterback that you drafted number 4 overall that you knew from the start needed reps to begin with. This isn't just a quarterback thing either, and we went over how the Lions have rebuilt their team over the past few years and how they've become one of the best teams in football. What I think should be remembered within the Lions rebuild that people either don't remember or didn't realize it was happening was there was a point where people were calling for both Brad Holmes and Dan Campbell's jobs. 2 years ago right now, the Lions were 1-6 and had started the Dan Campbell era with a 4-19-1 record. This may seem like a lifetime ago, but there were people tweeting actively that Brian Daboll and Joe Schoen were something along the lines of 6-2 and had more wins than both Brad Holmes and Dan Campbell during their rebuild of the Giants. But since then, the Lions are 27-8 and went to the NFC Championship game last year and look like they are going to the Super Bowl this year. Hell, they might even win the Super Bowl. I look at a team like the Lions and look how they've rebuilt from the ground up, and I think they are the blueprint model for how to rebuild in today's era. On the other hand, I look at the Saints and look at how they haven't been to the playoffs since 2020, and since the start of the 2021 season, they have a 27-32 record and have been, by every definition, treading water. That point, of course, is about how teams rebuild, but I think it applies to quarterbacks too. What would have happened if Jordan Love, a raw prospect in the 2020 draft class, went to the Colts and they started him right from the beginning? How different would the results be for Jordan if he started as a 22-year-old fresh out of Utah State? I don't know, and the reason I bring Jordan Love up is because he's a gunslinger at the position, which can be good and bad. I think Jordan Love is a very talented quarterback, but would he have thrown more interceptions than touchdowns, and would Indy have come close to developing him the way Green Bay has over the past few years? I personally don't think they would have, and we can even go back to Zach Wilson in 2021. I wasn't the biggest fan of Zach coming out of BYU, and I thought he was the definition of a boom or bust prospect, and I don't think it should be a surprise that a player throwing to Elijah Moore, Corey Davis, Keelan Cole, and Jamison Crowder in his rookie year didn't pan out. Now, they eventually drafted Garrett Wilson and Breece Hall, but the Jets are still 2-6 with a much better quarterback than Zach Wilson. Now, I'm not saying Zach is going to go down the Sam Darnold route, and I don't think that's a reality for every quarterback disappointment drafted in the first round, but this mentality of we are going to have our franchise savior from day one has to stop, and in the cyclical sense, I think this is going to stop, and soon. Yes, you are still going to have teams that draft a quarterback in the first round and expect them to single-handedly turn the franchise around, but if the past few years have shown anything when you look at the league from afar, quarterbacks need time, and throwing a 21-year-old quarterback into a fire and expecting them to have every answer in the book does not work out as often as teams would like. Hell, Caleb Williams, who was one of the better quarterback prospects over the past 10 years, personally I would say two only behind Trevor Lawrence, as a prospect of course, has struggled in the early parts of his rookie season. And what did we hear all summer long about Caleb? All we heard, and yes, I also echoed this, and I don't want to act like I was screaming anything different from the mountaintops, but what most of us said was that this was the best situation a number one pick has ever walked into. Now, I do stand by that, and I still think that's true, but Caleb has struggled at times throughout his rookie year. Now, to be fair to Caleb, it's been due to a variety of reasons, whether it's due to his offensive line, which was always a problem even entering the year, or his offensive coordinator, or anything else. It has not been all sunshine and rainbows the entire time. I think he will be a great quarterback over time, and he is far from the major problem in Chicago, but if Caleb is struggling in a great situation, should we be surprised that Bryce Young and Anthony Richardson, who were thrust into worse situations, and especially Bryce, also struggled? No, and I think this goes back to the NFL being cyclical, and I think we're going to see teams look to give their first-round quarterbacks a year to sit more than they have over the past 10 to 15 years, and I think that would benefit everybody: the player, the team in the long run, and of course, the fans. Now, I do think the Anthony Richardson situation is a bit of an outlier, and I thought it was always going to be an outlier. This was a player who had started less than 15 career college games, and a player right now, a year and a half into his NFL career, that has started less than 25 games since he graduated high school. We always knew that Anthony Richardson was going to need time to develop in the NFL, and time to develop means reps, of course, and in-game reps. Now, it would be ignorant for me to sit here and say, hey, Shane Steichen, you should play Anthony Richardson, even though we all know that Joe Flacco right now gives this team a better chance to win, and it would be ignorant for a few reasons. Right now, Joe Flacco gives the Colts a better chance to win. The routine plays are there with Flacco, and while Anthony Richardson went 10 for 32 against the Texans in Week 8, I think for any Colts fan, that watched that game knows it wasn't a true 10 for 32. Obviously, 10 for 32 isn't good by any means, but there's been far worse Anthony Richardson games over the first year and a half of his career, or over the first 10 games. But it would also be ignorant to ignore that there are 52 other guys in the Colts locker room, and if you are an offensive lineman like a Quentin Nelson or a Ryan Kelly, and you are battling every play, and you are, Bears wrestling, you are 300 plus pounds, and you are fighting for your life every play, because, the reality is, if you are an offensive lineman, you get rolled up on, your season's done. Not just past couple of months of work, but 25 years of work of your life to that point could result in one final play because of you getting rolled up on. So for them to hear that Anthony Richardson tapped out when they are, again, fighting for their lives in the trenches every play, I feel like the benching was most definitely warranted. But it would also be ignorant to sit here and say, hey, Shane Steichen, you need to play Anthony Richardson. Again, knowing that Flacco gives the team a better chance to win, but what also needs to be remembered is Shane Steichen's job is effectively on the line, and when the Colts selected Anthony Richardson 18 months ago, he was always going to be a project quarterback. Everybody on the planet knew he was definitely not the most pro-ready prospect at the position in that draft. There was a reason he was selected as the third quarterback, and everybody knew it was going to take time. What also has to be remembered is I can't sit here as an analyst and say, hey Shane, I have absolutely nothing in the Colts organization, and you need to play Anthony Richardson strictly because he needs the reps. Now, I will say that despite what the Colts say to the press, that I do think this is kind of a one-game suspension because of the comments that AR made about the taking the play off, and I think that is a really big deal, and I think that rubbed a lot of linemen wrong, and it should have, because that's not something anybody wants to hear, especially for the big 300-pound maulers that are giving their all every single play, and there's no doubt those guys are especially gassed after plays and drives, and for the leader of their franchise and the face of a multi-billion-dollar company to tap out is not a good look. I also can't sit here as somebody that has zero financial interest in the Colts organization and say, hey Shane, there could be food taken out of your wife and kids' mouths if you don't bench Anthony Richardson and give your team a better chance to win so that you can come back and coach next year. So this whole decision to bench AR and to play Flacco, despite everybody knowing that Flacco gives the team a better chance to win now, is a lot more complicated than just, well, Anthony Richardson needs time to develop. And why I think the NFL is going to go back to be a development phase with quarterbacks, and why I think it's going to be more cyclical, is there have been a tremendous amount of quarterbacks fail because the transition from college to the NFL, believe it or not, is insanely difficult. And this also goes back to a problem that we have with offensive linemen right now in the college ranks, and we discussed this in a video a couple of weeks ago, but guys, NIL in college is a huge deal, and if you have to recruit a 17 or 18-year-old kid to go to your university and then have to, in the back of your mind, worry about them potentially transferring because, hey, this college might offer them, a couple of $100,000 more per year or whatever the case may be. And by the way, I don't fault those kids for making those decisions to better financially suit their families. And if you were a 19-year-old kid and you had the opportunity to make a couple of extra $100,000 a year, let's be honest, we know what that decision would be. But this plays into developing in the NFL and getting guys pro ready, because there's going to be a quarterback problem in a couple of years where guys simply aren't close to as ready, and if they are, they're going to be the 24-year-old rookies like Bo Nix and Michael Penix. And not that there's a problem with that, but the 21-year-olds getting drafted, I think, is going to come to a, not screeching halt, but I think it's going to decline over the next couple of years, because like we mentioned, college coaches don't have anywhere close to the amount of time to spend on football when they also have to worry about NIL. In turn, that means quarterbacks are nowhere close to as developed as they have been in years past, and obviously there's going to be exceptions like Caleb Williams and like Jaden Daniels, who also is 23 going on 24 for that matter. But this goes back to the NFL and being cyclical and having to have patience, because if teams are not willing to have patience, there's going to be 6 or 7 New Orleans Saints across the league where, hey, let's just keep going in, despite being an 8-9 team, despite being a 9-8 team, never really having a chance to win the Super Super Bowl, but because we don't want to bottom out and really acknowledge that we should rebuild, then we are going to continuously tread water and not really ever get closer to winning a Super Bowl title. So that is the main reason that I think the NFL is going to go back to developing quarterbacks and letting them rest for a year. And I think the Falcons and Vikings are doing everything, in a sense, everything right with their rookie quarterbacks in Michael Penix and JJ McCarthy. Now, JJ unfortunately got hurt, but the point is, I think those teams are going about it the right way in an era where you see quarterbacks thrust into poor situations like you never have before. I hope you enjoyed today's video, and if you did, please like and subscribe, as only about 42% of people watching are subscribed and helps the channel tremendously. Until next time, please be safe and have a great day. Love you guys.